My guest today is Dr. Ian Williams, who is my co-host for this program. Welcome, Ian.
Thank you, Gill.
Yeah, thanks for doing this. So we have been doing this series of, I guess, two people talking to each other, which is an interesting concept.
Increasingly
Uh,
unusual today. We should be texting. That's the way to do it.
we should be texting. So, that's a interesting technology, actually. We could have a podcast with texting,
Yes,
possibly.
it's the new
Um,
epistolary novel or philosophical disquisition, texting. Yeah, makes it
yes, yes.
specific and precise.
Yeah, so 10,000 years after, um, we have reached a position that we don't want to talk to people anymore. We
Right.
just want to text
Yeah,
them.
I know.
Um, anyway, so I just want to put a disclaimer out there again. So neither of us are practicing. Neither of us is practicing academics. So we don't go to cognitive science, neuroscience, artificial intelligence conferences. But I would imagine both of us have a lot of biases that we want to talk about. And so most of what we say here could be pure speculation. Um, the academic community might look at this and say, yeah, it's either common knowledge or completely useless speculation. But then science advances through speculation as well. So this is one of the reasons we want to do this, right?
It is.
So, so we have a meaty topic today. We want to talk about consciousness,
Yeah.
and I don't even know where to start. So, um,
Oh, could I suggest something, Gill,
yes,
before you do start?
yeah, yeah,
Um, as is often the case, and in fact, I would say nearly always the case, when discussing a topic, particularly something that has implications in philosophy and science, etc., um, I find that people seldom define their terms.
yes,
And so I think it would be very important, at least to start. We may have multiple definitions of consciousness, but let's
yeah,
at least start with one. We don't have to
yes,
agree on it, but you or I might say, this is what I think consciousness is. And then
yeah,
we can discuss how we feel about that, what it could be, how you could explain it, et cetera, et cetera. Um, so
yeah,
if we don't, I think oftentimes, and as I read the literature on consciousness, which I've been doing for 60 years, people often talk past each other on that. So um,
yeah. So definitions are important. So let's start with that. So what is your definition of consciousness?
my definition of consciousness would be experience. So what I mean by that is if I say, "Oh, the sky is blue," and you say the sky is blue, we can do a series of objective scientific experiments. We can point a spectrometer at the sky, we can get wavelengths, we can reproduce that, and then we can look at paint chips, and you say, yes, that's what I see, and I say, yes, that's what I see. And we may, for example, on that score, you may pick out a darker, let's say, color than me. And that may be due to a lot of biological phenomena, cataracts, nerve issues in your brain, who knows what. But the one thing, so you can begin to reduce um, that feeling, that experience of blue to certain measurable, disaggregatable phenomenon. What you can't, I think, disaggregate, and this comes back to my definition,
Hmm.
is the experience of blue. And the problem with, I mean, why consciousness is always defined as being perhaps the only or the most difficult or hard problem that humans face is because there's no intersubjectivity.
Hmm.
So it you can't understand or measure what I say when I feel the color blue, but nor can I you. but you can with other things that we report. So I think that makes a major hurdle in trying to explain consciousness. And anyway, that would be my entering definition.
Yes.
It's the essence of experience. And then as we achieve multiple or experiences in our life,
Mm.
the fusion of all of those constitutes me. So when I say I and think about me as a separate entity, unique, etc., as we all do, it's
Yeah.
my unique collection of experiences um, that constitute that. And so it's
Yes.
the go ahead.
No, no. So sorry to interrupt. So the problem with that, let me challenge you on that. Um, the problem with English as a language is that it has too many words. Actually, many other languages, the language that I grew up in doesn't have, I mean, I was looking for it, doesn't have a word for consciousness at all. I couldn't find it. There has to be something in Sanskrit or something like that. I couldn't find it.
Is this
Um,
in Hindi?
in in Malayalam, which is this
Malayalam.
southern
Okay,
part,
right.
yeah. Um, and so in English we have a lot of flexibility. Let me put it that way. So we now replace consciousness with experience, but does it really advance our thinking? I mean, um, okay, I understand experience, but I didn't understand consciousness to start with. So definitionally, um, we are a little bit playing with words, aren't we? I mean, do we
Well,
really have a concrete understanding? Yeah.
there's two things here, and you just raised a very interesting issue, which a lot of people have talked about for a number of different things. But in Malawi, so you're in Kerala, right? And you're out
Yeah.
having a few beers with your friends, and you're saying, well, I was reading this, that, and the other, Crick, of Watson and Crick fame, who's sadly now dead, but he was at Stanford trying to understand consciousness. That was the latter part of his scientific career, and he, defined this as the truly hard problem. And
Yeah.
so, if you wanted to communicate that to your friends in Kerala,
Hmm.
what would you say? No, what
Yeah.
would
So
you
I don't have a
say? The
language.
problem is,
Yeah.
I know, but if Kerala, if Malawi, not Malawi, what's it called? What's the language? Um,
Malayalam. Malayalam. Yeah.
Malaya.
Yeah.
It doesn't have that term. What do you say in place of that term to say to your friends? People consider this the hardest problem remaining for humans to solve.
Hmm. So I have to say I'm not an expert on that language.
You don't have to be. Well,
Yeah.
no, you.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sort of
Yeah.
interested in
Yeah.
um, what do you? I mean, obviously, it's full
Yeah.
of intelligent people who are wrestling, and philosophers and scientists. They mean they must deal with this question all the time. But if they don't have a word for it, do they just resort to English, like we resort to French or a myriad other languages for
Yeah.
expressions we don't have in indigenous English?
Yeah. So let me ask you. So when you were growing up in England, let me put this in sort of a in context. When I was growing up, I never thought about consciousness as a subject, as a property, as a thing I want to think about. I was never taught in literature, in music, in anything that this is a property of interest. So when you were growing up in England, was consciousness a big thing? I mean, did you really think about it when you were growing up?
Well, no, but I think that's in common with many other things. You don't. One tends not to stop to think about something that's so intrinsic that, for example, I didn't think about till quite later in my life what memory was, right? So memory is just something, it's an attic in your brain or whatever. But when you actually start to think about it, it's more. So I think particularly if you study philosophy or talk to philosophers, you very soon become aware of this thing called consciousness, I
Hmm.
think. And And then as soon as you become aware of it, it's like time. Time is very difficult to define, right?
mm,
One can talk about in movement and relativity and all kinds of things. It's very difficult to define. And so we have each of us woolly definitions that seem to work. Okay. And so much with consciousness, which is why I was so keen that we agree on some sort of definition before we go forward.
mm.
People will just say, well, that's being awake. It's being, you know, responsive to one's environment, all kinds of things, able to assimilate facts, to make interpretations. All of this constitutes consciousness. Whereas I don't think it does. I think it's something very important. So there's a guy called Chalmer, philosopher,
The
who
hard problem, yeah.
yeah who's tried to separate the easy part of consciousness, which is all the
Mm,
things I just mentioned, and the hard part, which is this feeling, this experience,
mm,
And just to close the loop on him a bit and see what you think of this, he developed his theory, just to sort of get things going, is that there is that consciousness is made up of two parts. There is the sort of physical, observable, measurable stuff that we go through with life. And
mm,
then there is information. And he thinks information is not, you can't disaggregate information.
mm,
It is a sort of what can I say, a unique and intact thing. And that it has dimensionality and uniqueness and is considered as a whole. And then as you gain all these different pieces of information as you go through your life,
mm.
this builds and this sort of underpins consciousness. So much like, for example, I suppose, I mean, in quantum physics, you have non-locality. You have these concepts which are new, which
Yeah.
enable discussion and move science and thinking forward. He's arguing that consciousness then perhaps should be predicated on this concept of information being a separate, disaggregatable entity.
Mm,
Um, I don't know, but I think that's probably something that I find appealing because a lot of people have thought about this very hard for a long time and have not
mm,
been able to, people, I would have waved my hand, I don't know, a few years ago and said, well, it's just a bunch of electrons buzzing around in neuronal circuits and they generate a field and it's this field interaction, some sort of bullshit like that. But
mm.
anyway, so we got
No, no.
sidetracked there. 'Cause I was interested, because that's what I was thinking. I was coming to your point. And the other thing I've read, and then I'll stop talking, is that some people have hypothesized that so consciousness only came into being as a discrete entity about 3 or 4 thousand years ago. And prior to that, people just didn't think about it, which is what you were kind of suggesting. I mean, most of the world doesn't think about it. They go on their daily lives, right? It's only the philosophers who are paid or scientists to try and understand it that think about it. Um, and that it was something that was necessary as human societies became more complex. They needed to interact with one another to develop theories of mind, and maybe this consciousness, this thought that I am somehow unique and I feel and see things in a unique way, which this chap over here may not. And I better try and understand what that is, because if we're going to collaborate or not kill each other, etc.
Mm.
So
Yeah. So the fact that people didn't think about it, um, from my perspective, is not relevant in the sense that apples fell out of the trees for a very, very long time.
it's true.
And somewhere around 1700s, one guy asked the question, why do apples fall down? And we got Newtonian gravity. And so the fact that people didn't think about something has, in my view, has no relevance. But the property existed or did
Well,
not
did it?
exist,
Yeah,
did
yeah,
not
right,
exist. So we
sure,
don't know, right?
right.
Uh, and so there's clearly an well, there is, I cannot say clearly. There is some sort of an evolutionary trajectory here that the fact that we have a podcast talking about consciousness is sort of proof that there is an evolutionary trajectory to at least thinking about consciousness. I'm pretty sure squirrels get together, eat their nuts and talk about consciousness. We don't know. We cannot reject that possibility. Um, but we know here that we are talking about consciousness in a very specific way. But then is consciousness that specific as we make it out to be? So this is a downside of language. Uh, Language gives you a lot of flexibility, and the language leads you down blind alleys. Like I have a bias here, large language models, for instance. Um, because language gives you a lot of flexibility, it can take you places, and then you start thinking, oh, this is the thing that I've been looking for, but it's nothing to do with what you are as a biological entity, um, where consciousness really plays a huge role, right? So till LLM tells me what my conscious being is thinking about next, I'm pretty happy. Whether statistical physicists, Nobel laureates think we're all going to be wiped out, I'm not that worried. Yeah.
So you said a couple of things there which I thought were
Yeah.
interesting. So I'll pick up on one of them. And you said something to the effect that consciousness is very important, very essential. Um, is it? Why? What if we didn't have consciousness?
No,
What
no,
would
no.
happen to
I
humans?
didn't say it was essential.
Oh,
No. So
oh,
what I meant was, I don't know if I used the wrong words there. What I meant was consciousness appears to be sort of an evolutionary property, and we can have a baby without consciousness anymore. I mean, the baby comes
no,
into the
sure.
world with consciousness. So it's sort of going from Windows XP to Windows 11. So now all babies have Windows 11, and part of that is consciousness. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know. Let me just challenge that. So you say we can't have a baby without consciousness. If if we can't define it, how do you know it doesn't have it? So let's say, just for the sake of reductio ad absurdum, just let's just assume that there's a point mutation which confers consciousness. And this kid's born, I mean, there is a mutation which will take away consciousness. And this kid's born without it.
Yeah. Born
If we
without
can't,
consciousness.
yeah,
So do we have such a case?
not that I'm aware of. Well, that's what I'm
Okay.
coming to. Because,
Okay.
yeah, all right. So let's just assume that there is
Yeah.
this thing, consciousness, right? A separate entity that
Yeah.
we're struggling with to define and explain and articulate, what have you.
Yeah.
But let's say, well, since we can't define it, you can't tell its absence. So I was
Mm,
imagining that this, well, a charmer came up with a sort of an interesting experiment. So you have a human brain, right, with all these neurons. I mean, I know it's a ridiculous argument, but at least it adds flesh to this. So it has trillions of synaptic interactions and that. So let's imagine that you then build a a silicon chip brain with as
mm.
many connections. For every synaptic connection here, there's a silicon connection to another chip there, right?
Complete replication.
Complete replication, right? So then you start to um, and they're indistinguishable, right? In terms of anything you could ask or say or do to it, right?
Mhm.
Um, so then you start pulling chips away, putting them back,
Mm.
and then there's one point where you pull a chip away and you ask a question of the human and of the computer entity, whatever you want to call it,
Mm.
and there will be a difference by this one chip. What is that question? What is it? If you can't answer that, You can't say that every child has to be born with consciousness. And how do you know that I don't have maybe I don't have consciousness? I have a
Mm,
consciousness in terms of being awake, responding, using a language, all the other, what traumas would call the sort of soft parts of consciousness. But the
mm,
hard part, the sense of feeling, that when I look at a blue or a smell a rose, it's unique to me. And I don't know that you have that same feeling. How do you know? I don't have any of that. Maybe I'm just describing a rose, I describe a smell, all of which is perfectly understandable with our extended understanding of neurochemistry and biology.
mm. So, so your thought experiment has a precondition, and that is you can you can have complete replication.
Yes, of course, it's ridiculous, but yeah.
Uh, okay, so it is a really a thought experiment. There is
Yeah, absolutely.
no
But there are a million thought experiments.
yes,
Like Archimedes said,
yes,
if you stood on the
yes.
moon and you could lift the Earth, it's a thought experiment.
The problem with that is that the precondition that you can replicate, you can have complete replication in silicon of a human brain. The all the questions you're asking of that thing is sort of irrelevant in the sense that yeah, that's not possible. Well, based on our technology right now, it's not
No, that's
possible.
not that's
So
not that's not relevant. It's a thought experiment. Okay?
yeah, so well, it's a thought experiment, but it's a sort of a practical thought experiment, Ian. So you're saying, suppose I replicate the human brain in silicon,
Yeah,
which chip should I pull before it goes unconscious? But then, I mean, that's a very practical question.
yeah.
So you have to have some practical experiment to answer that question, right? So
No, you don't. No, you don't.
yeah,
Well, the only
yeah,
practical experiment you have is a sort of an interrogation experiment. You have to be able to ask a question of each entity and see something change.
yeah. But there's no answer to it. Is my point. So which chip should I pull before the silicon
Well, the point is you
mount
can't.
goes unconscious? Yeah,
Well, yeah, but that's the point of the experiment. The point is that it, I've reduced it to one chip at a time of the 8 trillion or whatever it would be, but you might have to pull 28 or whatever to get the simultaneous. But the point is, if if there is some combination, well, let me put it in a different way.
yeah,
It's like language, since we started with language. So humans are, well, we're not unique in our ability to develop and use language. Lots of um, animals can do that, but not in the complexity and subtlety that we have.
yeah,
So, sequencing the genome and then the um, expressed genome and all the various proteins, people have looked for those differences and they point to certain genes, some of which
yeah,
are involved in vocal control and different things like that. Some are in parts of the brain. Um, to try and find out what it is. Is there just one or two genes which confer this ability?
hmm,
Um, and so by that same kind of experiment, which is very difficult to do because of the brain's complexity, but in theory is possible.
hmm,
But the only reason I bring that up is to challenge you to say and that's where I started this whole thing. What is it that would disappear? So with with speech, it's very clear. If you
yeah,
delete the HOX4 gene or something like that, then the ensuing mutant wouldn't be able to talk.
yeah.
What? But you can tell that, right? It can't, whatever. Whereas with consciousness, and if you can't
Hmm.
define that, I'm not sure where we can go.
Yeah, so I'm a big proponent of um, the fact that reductionist approach to the brain, especially for consciousness, is never going to work
Right. And I would agree with
because
you.
yeah, because it's not reducible that way.
Mm,
And so all the AI noise, let me call it that way, um, is going to come to some screeching halt at some point in time. when they realize silicon mounts and large amounts of energy is never going to replicate the brain. So there is no replication of the human brain, I would argue. Um, well, at least for the foreseeable future. I don't know what's going to happen
Well,
100 years, 200 years
it
from
can
now. Yeah.
certainly replicate a lot. I mean, the latest projection I was reading the other day, 40%, 47%, very specific number,
Hmm.
of jobs are going to be taken over by AI.
Yeah, I mean, these are useless. I mean, sorry. These are not very interesting jobs
Well,
in the sense
they
that
may
yeah,
not be very
automation.
interesting, but
Yeah.
half the world is doing them. So
Yes.
the reason why I'm saying you can't replicate the human brain, it's not an all or none thing. It's a continuum. You can replicate the human brain's ability to recall facts, to write
Mm,
poems, to write papers, to write code better than most coders can do now. Yeah,
mm.
no, there isn't going to be you're not going to replicate Einstein and Beethoven. We're not going to have symphonies and whatever. Who knows, but probably not in the foreseeable future. But you can certainly replicate a lot of what the human brain does. So it's
Yeah.
not
So
all or
from
none.
policy perspective, Ian, I would argue these are jobs we want to eliminate
Well, that may
because
be, but
humans.
that doesn't
Yeah.
change my point. My point was you said you can't replicate the human brain, and I was drawing the distinction that the human brain, as least we define it, is a continuum.
You're assuming human brains are used in these jobs.
So, or what is an accountant doing then when he or she is adding up numbers and trying to find out fraud in big companies? They're not using their brain.
So all the jobs that are going to be replaced by I would argue, are jobs that human brains are not very efficiently deployed. These are people very unhappy, got to wake up at 7:30 a.m. and go to work, sit behind a computer, and then
You're
come
putting
back
in
at
chaff.
5:30.
Of course, we none of you disagree with what you're saying. That's all
Yeah.
true. I still come back to the fact that before the advent of AI, since you brought that up, those jobs had to be done by humans because they're the only ones that had brain power to do it. I mean, a chimpanzee couldn't do it, you know, an
But we
abacus
can
couldn't
we
do it.
can now replace them. Yeah, for
Yes,
sure.
right. Well,
Yeah.
but my point is, Gil, you were saying that um, the thought experiment is fundamentally flawed, and I don't think this is a criticism of the theoretical experiment, but because silicon, let's just call it silicon or AI, can't replace the human brain. And I was saying you can't make a blanket statement like that because there are clearly many aspects of the human brain that can be replaced by silicon.
Yeah, we don't know that. I mean, we have
Yeah, we
no
do.
evidence of any human
What
brain, part of human brain being replaced by silicon.
what about
Not yet. Yeah.
chess? What about chess?
What about chess? Chess is a algorithm,
Yeah.
very, very
No, no, it's
precisely
susceptible to
crafted
algorithm.
algorithm. Yeah.
Yeah. But I
Chess
mean,
could be replicated in 1960s. We didn't
yeah.
have to wait this long to do that. Yeah.
Well, I don't know, but in
Yeah.
1960, that's not true. It wasn't until Kasparov well, it doesn't matter when. But I mean, now for for things that really challenge human intellect, like chess and Go and
I
other,
don't think chess and Go challenge human intellect at all.
yeah,
Yeah, so we have a big diversion here. Chess and Go. So humans. So anytime you have an algorithm that's systematically applied, yeah, computers are awesome for it. I mean,
yeah, sure,
computers so much better than
yes,
humans. You
yes,
know, it doesn't have to think about when my next meal is going to come from or
yeah.
what I'm going to do on Monday morning. It doesn't have to think about all of that, right? So you can just go in and then implement the algorithm. Yeah. So we
It can
know
do more than
computers are very good at that. Yeah.
think. It's not because it has to think about how it's going to feed its kids. It's because it can look at, to all intents and purposes, an infinite number of possibilities, which a human brain simply can't do. So you can look at 8 trillion moves. I mean, every theoretical move on the board has been looked at by a computer, and hence it can beat anything. Um, so I'm not arguing that that is intelligence. What I'm arguing is that that's an attribute of the human brain
Hmm.
that Well, what's it an attribute of then? I mean, it's
So
not solved by your leg.
let me disagree, Ian. So the human has been here for at least 100,000 years, the Homo sapiens, but the ones before that were equally good, actually. And they didn't play chess, they didn't do Go. And yeah, last 100 years, or well, I don't know when chess was invented, maybe 1,000 years. We have these games, and you say, oh, the fact that humans can play these games is proof enough that humans are so much better than machines. And we have demonstrably proven that machines are so much better than humans on these games. And so what exactly are you arguing?
So what I'm saying is, to come back yet again, you made a binary statement that silicon AI, whatever we're going to call the shorthand,
Yeah,
computing,
AI. Yeah.
yeah, AI, um, can never replace the human brain. And
Yes.
I don't know if that's true, but
I don't
I,
know either. I'm
no,
making a
I know.
statement. Yeah.
Well, I know you
Yeah.
are. That's what we're
Yeah.
discussing.
Yeah.
Um, I my and I'll come back to what I've said several times now, is I think of the human brain's competence or capability, perhaps I should say,
Yeah.
um, as a continuum, and by which I mean it can do very trivial things, almost like a yes no binary problem solving,
Hmm.
to really quite complicated things such as chess and go, which involve very complex patterns, memory, strategy, all kinds of things, threatening moves that can disorientate their competitor, all of
Hmm.
which involve theory of mind, not just the algorithm of the game, perhaps, in order for them, humans that is, to be able to win the game. But a
Yeah.
computer can emulate that. It can't emulate, well, maybe it can. Maybe a computer can, by looking at past games, say, well, if I do this particular attack, it will be a bluff. Well, what it will cause my opponent to think this, which may unnerve him or her, and therefore my subsequent attack will be successful, which is sort of how a human might think. And a computer can mimic that just by looking at past patterns, right? So it can't um, do a Sistine Chapel painting or a Beethoven symphony
Yeah.
yet, but it might be able to. I don't know.
Yeah.
So I'm
So
just trying to draw that
no.
distinction. Yeah.
Um, there's something very fundamentally different from chess and Go and LLMs. Chess and Go are very programmatically driven.
Yes. Yes. Accept that.
The machine doesn't have to observe um, how humans are playing. It is very programmatic. We can actually program in the equations into the machine. That's what we've been doing for like 60 years, 70 years now. Um, the large language models and generative AI is of a different species. It's basically saying we're not actually programming in
No.
the equations. We're just going to feed it information and let it sort of figure out the equations, right? So we can't even audit the equations in the black box, so to
Right.
speak, right?
Right.
Um, and that also has a limitation. So this is what this is what the technology guys don't understand, which is so ChatGPT. I don't know 4.5. I think 5.0 is coming out. It has taken in all the information on the internet,
Yes.
everything.
Yes.
And now they're battling for proprietary information from all the companies.
Yes.
Um, my books will be in there. Not that it has any knowledge of any sense, but I think it'd be noise. Um, and so there's multiple problems here. One is a large company saying, "Yeah, I have hit the limit of internet. and then I need to get Pfizer data, Merck data, Boeing data to go further. And why do you guys hold this as proprietary? I mean, I have to get to it. And so the policy position here now in the new administration is that they're going to open it up. As a great CEO of automotive company said, just stop the patent laws stuff. We need to get all this data. Um, so we are sliding down a track, uh, and they believe that if they get all this patented data now, that ChatGPT 7.0 would be so much brighter. I seriously doubt it, actually.
Well, we're
But
talking, I
yeah,
don't know that
yeah,
we disagree with, I don't
yeah,
necessarily disagree with you, Gil. I think the way I look at it, as with all technologies, we're approaching an asymptote of what it
yeah,
can accomplish. Sure, if we did open all proprietary data, chucked all that in, we might get more refined um, solutions to problems for sure. I think we would do a much better job of AI-driven drug discovery because we'd have all the more, data from, as you say, Merck, Pfizer, and Glaxo, whatever.
yeah.
Um, and I'm not arguing that that they aren't limited. Absolutely, don't disagree with you.
Hmm.
What I don't think either of us knows is, and this is much back to our discussion about consciousness, is what the
Yeah,
next piece of machine competence, for want of a better word, will be.
yeah,
There will be something additional, I have no doubt, but it won't be based on large language model, which is always looking back, right?
yeah,
Um, so I think the reason when we got onto this interesting track here, and I don't think we're disagreeing. It's just a question of semantics, really. But I was sort of trying to make the argument that um, consciousness, if first of all, if we can't define it, we can't do anything. But let's go with the experience just for a moment.
yeah.
Um, it 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 might. Is it susceptible to disaggregation by pulling various silicon chips out of the model? Whether or
Mm,
not the model could ever exist, obviously not, but that's not the issue. Just as a thought process, or does it require the adoption
mm,
and of a new fundamental entity, which Chalmers calls information? But you take gravity, right? You brought gravity up, right? So Newton gets bonked, and before you know it, we can explain the movements of the universe. Um, but in terms of actually understanding gravity,
yeah.
we need to invoke, well, it's the Higgs boson. Somehow it comes back to something, a new sort of fundamental particle or a new entity.
Mm,
Is there a new entity that would describe consciousness? Or is it that we can't understand it enough to explicate it in what we currently understand? See what I'm
mm.
saying?
Yeah,
Which is not a cop out. It's not just saying, oh, well, there's some stuff out there, but it's really how we approach that problem,
yeah. So my argument, Ian. So I don't think we fundamentally disagree, but there's it's a different tangent. So my argument is that um, we can solve these problems by engineering reduction.
Right.
Um,
I agree.
uh, and we spend so much money, effort, time of 8 billion people on the presumption that we can solve it by reduction.
Yes.
And we have conclusively proved, I think, at least from an empirical perspective, it's not a reductionist problem.
Correct.
And so when we build mountains of silicon in Silicon Valley, you have to ask, is scaling up ChatGPT to 10.0 really going to solve this problem?
No, but
My suspicion is not. Yeah.
no, but I don't think anyone's arguing that well, maybe some of the hype will, but as I think perhaps we can both agree, what drives that is money, right? And so the ability to write a better program, um, whatever the problem that your money making enterprise faces,
Yeah,
most of those problems can be better solved by a better LLM AI. So
yeah,
ChatGPT 7.0 will do it quicker and faster and better than 2.1 would. Okay, fine, right. I mean, that's happened all the time. I mean, Mac
yeah.
operating system 18.01 is probably better than 101, but but that doesn't so that doesn't negate the amount of that's why those entities are those companies are so successful, right?
Yeah.
I think where we perhaps both agree is that they will develop consciousness or move into some new competence.
New
Um,
competence. Yeah. So let's talk about consciousness again. So
yeah,
um, I mean, clearly it's a hard problem, as they say. So let me advance a hypothesis. Since I haven't gone to any cognitive science, neuroscience conferences, I don't know if this has been talked about or have been solved already. My view on consciousness is that it's a hardware problem, meaning it's sort of putting a mirror in front of your brain. It's basically the brain is looking at itself
hmm
and making some conjectures, decisions, ideas from it. It's a reflection mechanism.
hmm
We don't have that in computing today.
no,
We have sort of linear processes.
yeah,
Data comes in, um, go through a neural net, out come some errors, we propagate that back, and ultimately you get an overfit system that can identify cats and dogs, but could never think about theory of relativity, I would say. And so we are on a wrong track here, I would say. This is money wasted. AI is a
yeah.
huge money
I think we should
wasting
move on from that.
mechanism.
We both agreed
Yeah,
on that. So now we're back on
yeah.
to. So let me reflect
Consciousness.
about what consciousness. Well,
Yeah.
so I just thought, and I think this is your theory. Correct me if I'm wrong. So there's a global workspace theory. It's called, which
Okay.
says that consciousness arises when information is broadcast globally through the brain, making it available to multiple cognitive systems. This workspace allows for information integration across specialized brain modules.
Hmm.
Is that so? You talked about it like a mirror.
Yeah.
So you can look into this mirror, and you you, you your brain.
Not me, my brain. Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's
Yeah.
I'm using you as your brain in this sense.
Yeah.
Your brain can look into this mirror and see the processes that it's going through. Is that what you're saying? What are you
Um,
saying?
yeah. So it doesn't have to look at the mirror all the time, but it might look into the mirror and sort of. So another way of thinking about this is that there's two parallel circuits in the brain. One is sort of doing things, and the other is sort of modeling things. And so every time I do something, there is some other circuit that's sort of simulating, modeling, predicting what could happen with it. So
hmm
that's a mirror that I'm talking about.
I see. Okay, yeah, and it's
And so,
using.
yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Go ahead. Sorry. Yeah.
And it's using the results of that mirroring to inform its actions and interpret what's happening.
It could instruct the actions. It could also not. It might be just sort of for a
Yeah.
future effect. Um, Especially if it doesn't have the capability. So this goes back to the left and right brain issue that I haven't really understood. Um, if the left right brain thing is true, Ian, so you know more about this than I do. The left brain is doing stuff. You know, it's very sure of itself, all the analytical stuff that it's doing, all the decisions it's making, and the right brain is sitting back and saying, "Oh man, I hope this kid grows up at some point." So there is some specialization in
Mhm.
sort of collecting data, making predictions for the future, not tactically, but more strategically. So that's the mirror that I'm talking about. Is the
Yeah.
brain really? Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Go
I'm not
ahead.
sure I'd use a mirror. I mean, what you're talking about is sort of the theory of a bicameral mind. And one could argue that more primitive organisms function on a sort of a, not that they have a left-right brain, but on a left brain sense. I mean, it's just looking at data, running algorithms, making predictions and acting. The right-hand side of the brain, which we have described as having the emotional, softer sides, more artistic issues. Um, I've always thought about that part of our brain modulating the left. So, in
Yes.
other words, I can listen to you talk, and part of my left brain says, "Oh, for God's sake, this guy's an idiot," and I would say that to you, right?
Yes.
My right hand,
Yes.
well, maybe you don't want to do that. Maybe you want to maintain his dignity and integrity, and therefore you'll soften it by saying, "Well, maybe you should think about that again." So
Yes.
that's how I see the two parts working in this sense. And so
Yeah.
they're
So
both
it
very
depends on
important for
the.
success,
Yeah.
for evolutionary success. You really do need
Yes.
the right brain modulating your left side brain.
So it depends on relative power of the
Yeah,
two halves, right? So
yeah,
it might be that the right brain, at some point might say, "Oh, I tried this. This thing is completely untrainable,"
yeah,
you know. Uh, and so there is some sort of homeostasis thing between the two halves, and you settle down to what you can help do, or you can improve do.
yeah.
Um, and so going back to sort of the consciousness question, um, I think consciousness. So I look at this from a hardware perspective, and I don't know how you think about it. I think this is a hardware issue. Consciousness is a hardware issue. We will never replicate this in software. So you can get all the software in the world to Silicon Valley. It's never going to be sentient, conscious, because they're lacking a hardware architecture that is fundamentally different from silicon that
Well,
we have currently
let's
invented.
hold that
Yeah,
for a second. Two
yeah,
things. I want to come back to something you said earlier,
yeah,
um, which I don't agree with, and that is the way I think about left-right brain again, and the way I think that it enters common parlance, and is certainly true, is as humans develop. I mean, their emotional competence and maturity doesn't really occur till late teens or beyond
yeah,
that. So
yeah,
even though they have very good left brain, that
yeah,
good as in the sense can accomplish all kinds of things, their ability to control, parse that, use that in a way, et cetera, comes, and hence, that's why we have rites of passage, puberty rites, et cetera, et cetera.
yeah,
And equally well, we were talking about autism the other week.
yeah,
Perhaps in severe cases of autism, the ability of the emotions and other theory of mind parts of the brain to control the left brain
mm,
is lacking or absent. And that's why perhaps with autistic people, can be extremely intelligent. And we
mm,
talked about scientists as being more on the autistic side of
yeah,
the dividing line, and so able to do complex issues there, but perhaps
mm.
not so good at getting funded because they can't understand politics. Anyway, so putting that aside, but you just said it's a hardware problem. Well, if it is let's assume it is. So perhaps when you brought up the right brain, there's the corpus callosum, which is this huge white
yeah,
conduit between the two parts of the brain. So that's an architecture problem, right?
yeah.
Well, why can't, if it's an architectural problem or a hardware problem, as you'd call it, why can't you build that hardware? Why can't that be built?
Well, I mean, the multiple issues here. One is the silicon chips that we build today are based on a set of assumptions. It's nothing to do with the brain.
No.
It has everything to do with availability of silicon and computing and electricity. There's no connection to the
Yeah, yeah,
brain.
sure.
And so this hardware company that has been going up and down in stock price, um, they make chips, and all the computing companies have been buying these chips, um, graphic board
Yeah, yeah,
chips,
yeah.
to do massive parallelization uh, of what's the right term? Deep learning, massive parallelization of deep learning, right? So none of the silicon inventions that we have had has nothing to do with the brain. And so at some point you sort of turn around and say, hey, we got all this great mountains of silicon. It should be the brain. There's no connection. I mean, I don't know how
Well, I think
scientists and
we've
technologists
accepted.
think that.
We,
Yeah. Mm.
yeah, well, I think we're coming back to what we've already discussed, right? I
Yeah.
think there's perhaps some who believe that, and I think they're probably wrong. I mean, believe that they can siliconize it. There are others who know full well that it won't, but it's marketing hype. And if they want to sell stock and shares and what have you, they're going to hold that as a promise. Who's to say they're wrong? It's up for you.
Yeah.
But there, no, I'm coming back to your statement that it's a hardware problem rather than the software problem.
Yeah.
So if that is the case, um, it 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 you should be able, perhaps by looking at the brain, to say, well, what is it? What is it
Mm.
about the hardware of the brain? And
Mm.
let's just trivialize it for the sake of argument as being a left-right brain problem. Let's assume that the left brain is functioning like a large language, whatever, and
Yes.
it's operating on logic, right, and analysis. And
Mm.
as we discussed, we know full well that the power of the human brain is to short circuit, modulate, and apply that kind of logic
Mm.
using experiential criteria that the right hand side of the brain has assimilated around these concepts of emotion, love, fear,
Mm.
hate, all of these things that don't reduce to an analytical piece of software.
Yeah.
And somehow the brain, through its architecture, so first of all, it captures both, right? It's got both
Mhm.
there.
Yeah.
And somehow it manages to use this right brain stuff to modulate the activity of its left brain and
Hmm.
thus confer human like behavior, which is never going to be achieved by a large language model, no matter how much data it has in there, because it doesn't have this. My question then, if
Yeah.
one accepts that as a model, why can't this that then causes us to, it's much like what is consciousness, is to take something like
Hmm.
love, all right?
Yeah.
Very difficult to define, okay? Almost impossible. But you could type into chat GPT 7, give me a definition of love, and it will come up with 15 different examples. And in theory, those 15 examples may only capture a small part of the human understanding of love, but it could
Mm.
then use those to modulate its left-hand brain large language model. You could sort of begin to see how you could use descriptions of fear and anxiety that are in
Mm.
the literature to modulate changes in a large language model output.
Yeah. So going with the hardware statement,
Yeah.
the heuristic I will use, Ian, is that 20 watts is what a human brain uses.
Hmm.
Um, so we got Newtonian gravity, general theory of relativity, and electromagnetism with just 20 watts. 20 watts. And if you say, no, I have to get, the great search companies investing in three nuclear plants because they're running out of power. I
Yes.
suppose. So if you say no, I need more energy to make this happen, you are in the wrong wrong track, because we had 20 watts created significant contributions to science, humanity, and technology. And if you say I need 20 multiplied by,
But you've dragged in
100,000
you've
watts
dragged in
to make
an
it happen. Yeah.
irrelevance, Gil.
Yeah.
I don't think you're addressing the question I asked, because yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, well, it's ever been the case when James Watt is looking at a kettle or whatever he was looking at and developed the steam engine. I mean, the first
Hmm.
steam engine was grossly inefficient, blah 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 blah. And
Sure.
the story, and that's true of all technologies, right?
Sure.
So yeah, we're using gigawatts or whatever, terawatts or whatever we're using in these large language models. But that may be an efficiency issue. But that's not really the point I was trying to make.
Hmm.
It just says to me, and I think we're saying the same thing, the architecture
Yeah.
that we're
It's
trying to use to
incorrect.
solve
Yeah.
it is incorrect, right? So,
Yeah.
and I was trying to offer um, a, a hardware. Is it possible that even through the large language model, you
Hmm.
could gain some understanding of what human love is and use that? So
Yeah.
the problem I think you type into Claude would be,
Yeah.
I'm in love with this woman, and what kinds of
Which one?
things? Well, there's so many. Now, what kind of things should I say or do in order
Yeah.
to make her love me? Okay. Now, I bet you can put that into Claude today, and it will come back with ridiculous things: take her out to dinner, whatever it might be.
Yes. Yes.
But
Yeah.
if it were more sophisticated,
Yeah.
it might say, well, you need to understand aspects of her character. I have a Venn diagram of all her experiences, a Venn diagram of all your experiences. Look at the shared, the overlap, the differences. These are the things that will pique interest. Therefore, say that. I mean, that's
Hmm.
entirely conceivable, but I don't think it's being done now. That was my point. So it's a
Yeah.
question of using that seems to me a hardware approach to solving the problem.
Hmm.
You see what I'm saying?
Yeah. Yeah. I like the hardware approach. I think the hardware guys have missed a trick. And so going back to consciousness, this is pure speculation. I have no data on it. I haven't done any research on it. Suppose the consciousness, as we talk about, resides just outside the brain, because we talk of this mirror effect, right? So it's sort of the brain looking at itself and sort of replicating or playing some sort of simulation game to try to predict what could happen. Um, if it resides just outside the brain, for instance, and that has to be magnetic um, to reside outside the brain, because it's not necessarily. I mean, it's not possible to be electrical or anything else. So suppose it resides outside the brain, we might have missed the trick, actually. So we look into the brain and you do all this EEG, all that stuff, looking into the neurons and how they communicate and all of that. That is all mechanical, and as good engineers, we can understand that pretty well. And the fact that we are failing on consciousness tells me that we are missing a trick. We are missing a trick in hardware. Um, it is not going to be solved by, better operating system or better software. There's
Mm.
something that we are completely missing in the
Mm.
whole construct. Is my hypothesis. Yeah.
Well, it's an interesting hypothesis, and I think there are a couple of things you said that are worth double clicking on. So basically, you're saying that it's an extra corporeal phenomenon that's generated from within the body, and the only thing that you could think of that would satisfy that would be magnetism of some force, a
Yeah,
magnetic
yeah.
force in some sense.
From a
Um,
physical sense, yeah.
yeah. So, and that's very testable, right? I mean, you just put some strong magnets in somebody's head and see if that changes their consciousness. I mean, it's straightforward, and I'm sure that's been done. So it's not going to be the answer, Gil. You have to think of something else. So then so then you have to come up with some other thing, which is
Yeah.
gets back to the idea that a lot of that's not an idea, just the suggestion a lot of people have had that there is some force we don't understand, just like in 12th century you didn't understand magnetism and now we do. So there's something there which we will understand in
Hmm.
tomorrow or in a millennia time. um, but I'm now sort of coming back and sort of a bit more um, enamored or questioning
Yeah.
of your assertion that it's not a software problem. So
Yeah.
let me ask this question, which is sort of a bit of a repetition, just bear with me.
Yeah. Yeah.
So if you got the large language model at the moment, we know how that works, we know its limitations, we know its properties, okay? And it's not getting there, right? And it's going to be asymptotic because there's only so
Hmm.
much stuff it can go out and grab.
So we think, I don't know. I
So
mean,
we
it
think,
might get there.
well,
Yeah.
we
Yeah.
talked about the other thing that maybe it could
Yeah.
create its own experiments. It could do things,
Sure.
quote,
Yeah.
and there'll be new data,
Yes.
right? I mean, because they go and shoot
Yeah.
12 people in Trafalgar Square and let's see how humans behave. You know, I mean, there'll be new data you could get.
Yeah.
But, let's just say that for the moment. And so what I was wondering is whether there is software that could be written to ask the question of the database,
Hmm.
all the database that's out there, that would give information on and I can't think of another word other than the softer, more ephemeral issues, such
Hmm.
as hate, fear, anxiety, etc. Let's take anxiety.
Hmm.
There are certain attributes of anxiety that you can explicate using a large language model. And what I mean by that is, if you say to the large language model, what are the symptoms of anxiety in a human? It will tell you all of those. What are the things that cause anxiety in a human? It will tell you all of those. And in that way, you could then
Yeah.
possibly write software that says, okay, take all the data that have caused humans to be anxious
Hmm.
and use that to guide the answer to the question of how should I invest $100 in biotech? So
Hmm.
you say, so how should I invest $100 in biotech? This
Hmm.
is asked every day, I'm sure, right? And I'm sure that AI spews out a bunch of answers, right? Depending on your risk factor, your age, your money, whatever. If
Hmm.
you then put a different level, I doubt whether well, I suppose asking about your risk factor, but it doesn't really help you very much to say how risk averse are you. It's hard to answer that question. But if you say, okay, this strategy, based on my explication of the literature, is
Hmm.
likely to be anxiety provoking, and therefore you you see what I'm saying? I don't know that that's being
I
done.
like
Do you know?
I like the idea. Yeah. Yeah. So 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 I want to take that idea and go in a slightly different direction, which is, as you said, suppose I can use it as a diagnostic tool. And so some sort of CNS deficiency, depression, schizophrenia, or something, right? And then I put that individual in front of a machine, go through a process of going back and forth on the chat machine, so to speak. It should have a lot of diagnostic information.
Mhm.
And then I don't know if it has been done yet, but we could use LLM as sort of a diagnostic machine,
Sure.
not necessarily as a decision machine. And that's that's what they're trying to do. Decisions are quite different from diagnostics, and
Yeah.
this might be a better application for LLM, I would
Well,
say. Yeah.
I think it's being done, and I
Yeah.
think that's going to be an important future of medicine because of the cost increasing paucity of clinicians. I mean, in the United States, I don't know, it costs 3, 4. You know, you have a daughter who's been there. I mean, hundreds of thousands of dollars, right? And
Yeah.
she can only work 60 hours a week and survive. Whereas you could have a machine that would
She
have all.
sometimes for 120 hours, which
Yeah,
is
well,
quite
yeah, which is, yeah. I
perplexing.
mean,
Yeah.
would I want, not talking about your daughter, would I want to wake up and see a guy who's been working for 120 hours who's trying to diagnose
Yes.
me? No, I'd much rather have a machine that can ask a zillion questions of me and come up with a better answer. But that's
Mm.
not really. I am sure that the large language models will be used for clinical diagnosis. But I'm coming
Yeah.
back to my other thought, which is trying to somehow capture
Mm.
complex emotions, and I picked on anxiety or whatever, but
Mm.
using those, that it will disaggregate that. It will look at every mention of anxiety, and then it will look for every mention of people sweating under certain conditions, wherever, pull all
Mm.
that together and say, these are the things that seem to cause this thing called anxiety in humans. It doesn't know what anxiety is, it's just got that, right? And then when you ask it a more straightforward question,
Mm.
where should I invest $100? It
Yeah.
can then filter or use that to give more EQ,
Mm.
emotionally intelligent answers, instead of a
Mm.
pure IQ driven answer.
Yeah. So let's go abstract a little bit more, Ian. So consciousness, back to consciousness. Um, why does it exist? I mean, what advantage? So could put in the human context. What advantage does it have for humans?
Well, I don't want to bore everybody and you by coming back to saying, what the hell do you mean by consciousness? But
Yes.
if I just sort of take this sort of blob of stuff that people tend to mean by consciousness,
Yeah.
what advantage does it give? Um, well, if you take a really hardcore, like as I started, uh, consciousness is the experiential sense you get when you think about something.
Mm.
I don't know that it gives any advantage. If you mean something like the ability to understand the theory of mind,
Mm.
to be able to look at you and seeing you're getting a bit bored, your eyes are getting glazed, you're looking over your shoulder.
No, I'm not bored
Therefore,
at all.
and I'm just kidding. And therefore, I
It,
know I need to change what I'm
yeah.
saying if I want to keep your attention. I mean,
Yeah.
you could argue that's a fairly sophisticated use of the
Mm.
brain that might encompass consciousness and therefore would afford a survival value, big time.
Yeah.
I mean, so
So,
that would be my.
yeah.
But I again, we sort of slipped into this, not really understanding our definition. If you
Yeah.
accept my latter argument, then it's a
Yeah.
different definition of consciousness than my first one.
Yeah. Now let's stay this sort of not very well defined regime. Uh,
It's what I
and
say it
so,
is.
I mean, as I say, it's a tough problem. Um, so you sort of argue that it has some survival benefits.
Yeah.
Um, do you think it was a step function change? It's like 20,000 years ago,
Hmm.
no consciousness, and one Monday morning, somebody wakes up in African savannah and she can now see who she is. I mean,
Right.
that would have been an incredible experience. So is it sort of analog, meaning is it sort of progressing in time, or is it a sort of a step function change that somebody woke up on Monday morning
Yeah.
and became
Well,
conscious? Yeah.
I would argue that it's a gradual change, and personally, although I of course cannot prove it, I think that um, consciousness exists perhaps down to the level of plants.
Mm,
Um, there are many examples, for example, for where, for example, if an insect infects a tree and starts to chew its leaves, then
Yeah.
that tree releases chemicals through the roots that affect other trees,
Yeah.
which is a kind of a warning system and enables other trees to survive. And
Mm.
now you can say, well, that's straightforward biochemistry, right? But I
Mm.
mean, there's an element of what is fuzzily described as consciousness there. And I
Mm.
think that it just grows in sophistication and application
Mm.
through evolution. But let's come back to your woman who I would say so Homo sort of the Homo genome first Homo sapiens sapiens genome first came together about 250 k years ago.
Yeah.
Um, let's assume that there wasn't a consciousness there.
Mm.
And as we've sort of argued, people could perhaps survive extraordinarily well. You don't need it, right? So then along
Yeah.
comes this woman one day, she's born, and then, she's 12, 13, 14, 15, and she realizes, or
It
she's
could be a
always,
baggage. It could have some
well,
negative
it could, but let's
effects.
just hold this for a second. Let's
Yeah.
just say that throughout her life, she's always thought of herself as being someone in here.
Mm.
She has this experiential feeling, which apparently my mother doesn't. Um, now, is that going to give her an advantage? I'm not
Mm.
sure how it would. If
Yeah.
it's
I
just
don't.
on that
Yeah.
feeling issue,
Yeah.
again, it's a definition problem. But I don't think all of
Yeah.
a sudden, I don't think there's any evidence for this, that that there is a mutation that then
Mm.
confers this amazing sort of reproductive advantage or fuel assimilation advantage, which would then cause that to be adopted throughout the population very
Yeah.
quickly.
Yeah. So you talked about this one time when we're talking about the subject peripherally, and I think that makes a lot of sense. So uh, consciousness or the evolution into consciousness might have given survival benefits for many reasons. So now you can read into somebody's mind
Yeah.
and sort of understand what that person is thinking. And that has many, many survival benefits, both in terms of, trying to understand your enemy and trying to understand your friend and, mating
Sure.
and all of that stuff. And so in that context, consciousness has to be an attribute that is selected, you think?
Oh, if that's true, and I would think it would be, I think it would be, well, yes, it would be selected, but I think what we need in order to understand that selection process, I think one has to go further back in the evolutionary chain, as I said
Yeah.
earlier, where I think consciousness evolves so that, for example, let's just imagine the consciousness of an ant. I don't know
Yeah.
how far back that goes in the evolutionary chain. Is not, I would hazard or think, an ant walking around thinking, well,
Hmm.
I'm an ant. I'm unique from the 8 million others that are scurrying around with me. Um, it
Unless
probably
you are
is
the
a,
queen ant. The
well,
queen
that's
ant
true.
is
Yeah,
special.
that's true. Um, but it might be a very, very modest and minor change in neuronal architecture
Yeah.
that enables some small incremental advantage, not
Mm.
a step function.
Mm.
And that's adopted, and then that dominates, and
Mm.
then that's passed on, and then there's another one. So I think it's more likely to be that
Mm.
consciousness is conferred by a whole um, panoply of different genes and
Yeah.
uh, entities that have gradually been taken up and applied to this problem, assuming, of course, that there is some biological advantage. And again, that comes back to our definition. If it's purely experiential, as I started
Mm.
this, I'm not sure that it does. If it's
Y-
if it's understanding theory of mind, as we've been talking
Yeah.
about, then hugely, I mean, no doubt. So,
Yeah. So I mean, this is sort of fundamental implications for physics also. So you argue that this is an incremental process. So you look at the ants, and ant X figures out how to deal with ant Y. There is no consciousness there yet, but there's a set of heuristics
yeah,
that gets programmed into the brain. And over time, there is a large set of heuristics that gets programmed into the brain. And that is what we call consciousness, you think? I mean, is it, I mean, it has a lot of implications from a hardware perspective, right? So it is just a collection of heuristics, you think?
yeah, 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 I think so.
A collection of
I,
heuristics. So, yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
yeah, well, I was just going to say, and if it is, that perhaps this collection then gains a property. So it's a
Yeah.
gain of functions.
Yeah.
So analogous might be, uh, so forgive me, this might be a more specialized chemistry issue, but um, if you take carbon atoms, if you make a ring of 6 carbon atoms,
Yeah.
um, it will have certain properties.
That's
But
a
if
aromatic
no,
ring or
no, not
no?
aromatic, aliphatic. Okay,
Uh,
so for people who are not into this means
yeah.
that there's certain kind of bonds there, and but if you make it aromatic and you take
Mm,
hydrogen away from some of the carbon atoms,
mm,
then the electrons in that molecule then start to form clouds above and below the plane of the carbon of the 6 carbon atoms,
yeah.
and that confers a whole new set of properties, huge, infinite,
Yeah.
almost. And maybe this is the same thing. So you're going along, that's a step function. But if you start
Yeah.
taking hydrogen atoms away from this 6 carbon aliphatic compound, there comes a time when it falls into this aromatic entity and has
Mm,
all these other functions. So that's kind of how I would think about that.
mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah. So, I mean, we clearly cannot solve this problem. Otherwise, we would have won the
Oh,
Nobel
I was
Prize.
carrying on it,
Yes.
Gil. I thought we were going to do it.
um, but it's an interesting thing to think about.
Oh, it really is. And
Yeah.
I would encourage you and others. Well, I don't know how much time. Let me just do this because I thought it was
Yeah.
kind of interesting. I went on to an AI system
Yeah.
and I said, tell me all the current theories of consciousness. I'm just sort of
Mm,
interested, right? So there was this
yeah.
global workspace theory, we talked about that. And then
Yeah.
there's integrated information when I talked about the idea that it's information that is the key of it. Then there are that's complete gibberish. It doesn't mean anything. Consciousness emerges from the brain's hierarchical predictive models about incoming sensory data. It represents the best guess. I mean, if this consciousness rises from the brain, creating a model of itself in relation to the world, this self
Mm,
model is transparent. We don't experience it as a model, but as reality itself. So we've made this model and
yeah.
we think it's real. Um, then there's recurrent processing from recurrent neural processing. This is like large language model. Feed forward signals are then fed back into earlier processing targets. I could go on. There's about 9 or 10 of these things, most of which I'm sure it's just my own ignorance, but the language is so imprecise and so difficult to sort of wrap your head around. It's really there's one by Dennett, who's a very famous
Yeah.
philosopher, who says phenomenal consciousness as commonly understood doesn't exist. Instead, the brain creates the illusion of qualia,
Yeah.
subjective experience
Yeah.
through
I've seen that.
complex
Yeah.
information processing. Um,
Right.
yeah. So, but
So
it's hard to
basically,
see.
yeah.
Go ahead.
So basically, we don't know anything about it,
No.
and you and I can come up with theories probably as good as the ones that you read off.
Yes.
And so there's sort of a policy question here, which is, so suppose we are interested in something like consciousness, and none of the theories actually do it,
Yeah.
at least on the surface. We don't really have a good definition.
Right.
Um, and definitions are important. Try to find it. Um, so should this be an area that we should actually invest in? So the larger question would be, okay, suppose you find it. Suppose NASA comes in and so we are a consciousness institute now,
Right.
and we're not going to go to Mars, even though the auto company CEOs tells us that we have to go. Instead, we're going to put that into consciousness. And um, so suppose we understand it. Do you think it will fundamentally change us? Do you think it will fundamentally make a difference?
Well, it sort of impossible. You could ask that about almost any investigation, right? But if understanding it then led to the possibility of replicating it,
Hmm.
then yeah, that will have a huge. Now, let's just follow that a bit further. Let's just
Yeah.
say, okay, somebody, let's just say it's a new force like magnetism, Eapenism. So Eapenism is found, and it's this stuff, and that's what gives,
It's everywhere.
it's everywhere, unfortunately, but there you go.
Yeah.
Um, so, would we want to reproduce that? I mean, that gets
Yeah.
back to the earlier question of what advantages it confer. It could be highly dangerous, right? And that starts to
Right.
give real credence to everyone's fear that AI is going to wipe us all out. If
Hmm.
AI had epanism, then it could be really bad news. The other side of the question is, since we haven't really been able to define a robust utility for it,
Hmm.
why are we worried about it? Why, only other than just scientific curiosity, which is innate. I mean, humans will always explore stuff, even though it has no
Hmm.
obvious utility. It's just the pleasure of doing it, right? That's the
Yeah.
utility in and of itself. So it will be understood. Your question though was the funding, and I think it's going to have a very hard time getting funding, particularly in today's
Hmm.
climate. But on the other hand, um, Einstein didn't need a lot of funding, right? I mean,
No,
so it might
you just
be
need a
so.
brain. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Which is
Yeah.
only takes 20 watts, as you pointed out. So,
Yeah.
so maybe it will be solved and won't need massive, uh, you know, um, Musk-like invention to achieve.
So
So
so let me take this in a little bit of a tangent. I think at some point we have to stop here. So 1900 to 1930, there were so many interesting brains that found so many fundamental things. And 1930 to 2025 now, there hasn't been any. As far as I can see, we built bigger computers, bigger buildings, faster aircrafts, bigger computers. That's all fine. But there's no fundamental change. And these things appear to happen in a step function, 1700s, big step function change, 1900s, huge step function change for about 30 years, and then nothing, nothing for 100 years. And then all the kids growing up thinking that, all the technologists are inventing all sorts of beautiful things. iPhone 17.3, beautiful. But no fundamental
right.
development. So what do you take away from that idea?
Well, one thought that comes into my head as you're talking, which actually would be a very interesting challenge now, was somehow to quantitate, and I don't know what metric you would use,
Yeah.
the various inventions that you just cited. So if we were to go back, let's start with perhaps the ability to uh, cause and control fire. That's one of the first technologies, right?
Mm, mm,
If you could actually carry the ability to make fire from one place to another, very important technology because that allows you to eat food that otherwise you couldn't. Da, 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 da,
yeah.
da.
Yeah.
So and then you think about how did that impact humans, right? In some
Yeah.
metric. And I'd say I don't know what the dimensions are. And
That would
then
have been the biggest impact ever for
I would say
technology, I would think.
I
Yeah.
would
Yeah.
suggest it is, yeah.
Yeah.
So then you come back to the next one, maybe the wheels, right? So maybe that
Yeah.
was done in a million places simultaneously, who knows? But there's another thing, right? And so you go through these big things, right?
Yeah.
And then I well, yeah. So I'm wondering, is it a low-hanging fruit issue? So
Mm,
if you argue that the universe is finite, there are only so many things out there to be understood, or one of the better
mm,
word. Have we have we taken all of the, even though they are way beyond the likes of you and me, all the easy stuff, including quantum theory and relativity and what have you,
yeah.
and therefore there isn't, you know, there aren't these things now to be so travel faster than the speed of light, understanding consciousness. Um, I'm not sure there are too many problems now. Of course, I don't know that people thought that the absence of relativity was a problem until it was explicated. So it's difficult, right? But that would be part of my question.
Yeah.
Otherwise, if you don't accept that, then you have to argue that the human race is not becoming dumber, I don't think, but is losing some incentive for this
Mm,
kind of discovery. We're not training or nurturing or but then you go back to these famous people, they weren't well trained. I mean, they weren't, you know, coddled in some way. They were just
yeah.
ordinary people, right? In one sense, growing up in ordinary families and all the
Mm,
conditions that we all go through all the time. So I'm not sure it's a nurturing issue. So
mm.
then you'd have to argue, well, is it an architecture problem? Is it all the plastics now that are getting into our brain that are making us unable to come up with new scientific ideas? It has to be one of those two, doesn't it? What do you think?
Yeah. I mean, there's a theoretical question here, which is, does humanity advance in step function changes? And if so, what causes those step function changes, right?
Mhm.
So, 100 years from now, if you had another step function change now, such as fusion, room temperatures, superconductivity, something like that. I mean, these are technical stuff.
Yeah.
But suppose somebody comes around and solves the dark matter, dark energy problem
Hmm.
in 2026. It makes a huge difference for the next 75 years, for the kids growing up. So the step function changes really do make a huge difference to
But
society.
by definition, right? I
Yeah.
mean, that's how you define a step function
Yes.
change.
Yes. So to society, though, this is where a little bit of a bifurcation happens. So most of the public, we got 8 billion people, 330 million in the US, say, yeah, all your scientists have all these notions about, finding new theories. It doesn't change my life at all.
Mhm.
I mean, why would I elect somebody to fund these things that you guys want to do? So we have a bifurcation in policy compared to science. And the scientists are increasingly smaller number of the population.
Yeah.
And so I think we have a problem in the long run, right? So it's almost like you're falling down a mountain, and there is no way to get back on top of it.
Well, again, I would come back to our old friends Newton and Einstein. they didn't have fun. Well, Newton was at Cambridge, so he had resources. Okay, I suppose you could call that the equivalent of an NIH grant today or something. But
Yeah.
Einstein didn't, I don't think. So I don't think the public has ever. Um,
So yeah.
Yeah, well, the public has, I mean, you'd call this an incremental change. I don't know. But the public, if I think about diseases, take something like HIV or COVID,
Yeah.
which were real threats. Everyone was scared to death of them, right? And
Yeah.
they were very quickly, relatively speaking, quote, solved by the development of therapies and vaccines
Yeah.
in response to public need, right? And
Right.
government because of public need. Um, so I'm not sure that's true, that the public doesn't care about them. I think,
Well, yeah. I mean,
well,
so the public cares about tactical effects. Um, Most of science is about 10,
yeah,
15, 20, 100 years from
yeah,
now.
yeah,
And it's very unclear
yes,
if you can convince the
yeah,
public to
yeah.
fund stuff like that, right?
That,
So,
well, you're
yeah.
absolutely right. You can't. I mean, you're absolutely right because the ones I just cited were all predicated on research that had been done much earlier and just built on those for sure. And yeah, it is a very difficult problem. I think there's a baby and bathwater issue, so we're straying a little
Mhm.
bit into politics now. But certainly, as a former scientist, there was an awful lot of what can I say? Not bad by any means, but useless science being done.
Mm.
Somebody just does more on the same vein, and it's just another publication that nobody reads or
Mhm.
cares about. But
Yeah.
you have then two problems. If you try and get rid of all that, you throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? You can't.
Mhm.
What are the important experiments that are being done? So it's very difficult. If you apply very stringent criteria to fund,
Yeah.
then again, you're not likely to fund really innovative stuff. You're more likely
Mm.
to fund stuff that's more likely to quote work or have a immediate utilitarian application.
Mm.
So it is difficult. And I think the only way forward is to do what we have done, even though it's been very expensive, and that's to um, uh, fund a lot and hope
Mm.
some of it makes it. There's a very interesting graph in today's New York Times, which I would encourage any viewers we have to look back on May the 17th. And it was looking at the cost to save um, a person year's life, okay,
Mhm.
of a variety of technologies.
Yeah.
And the cost to save a person year's life from arsenic poisoning was something like $300,000. The cost
Mm.
to save a person year's life from pneumonia vaccine
Mm.
was a couple of thousand. In other
Yeah.
words, and there was a wonderful all the different things you could invest in, safety
Yeah.
belts, fire hazard, public water, just all the way up to some of these more esoteric things. That
Yeah.
and a lot of those, the ones that cost a lot and didn't opt, to get that year's life, were often the ones that had the got people scared.
Mm.
It was irrational. But people were excited about that. They didn't want arsenic in our kids' milk or whatever it was.
Mm.
So they fund that, even though it would cost $336,000 to save 1 year life. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's a very difficult thing to educate people around that.
Yeah. So let's talk about policy for just a minute. I think we have to go. So we are in a regime with a lot of information, a lot of technical information.
You know,
Scientists consume it and try to make the best out of it. We have 8 billion people. Um, we have sort of a declining education tangent on that 8 billion people. And there is fake news to make things easier. The fake news says all the people who say they know something don't know anything. It is us who know stuff. Um, so so for me, it is like a losing battle in many ways, right? So we can try to fight it, but I don't think you can ever. It's a numbers game. So you got 330 million people in the U.S. There's 8 billion people in the world. 80% of them don't care about scientific information. Sometimes I don't care about scientific information either, Ian. So I ask questions. But generally speaking, you have to care about scientific information, but 80% don't. That means that from policy perspective, you cannot make it very objective because it's not going to go anywhere. So I don't know what the solution is, but
Yeah.
scientists, technical policy makers have to really internalize what the population dynamic is, right? So it doesn't matter, you go on TV and say, hey, you have to get the vaccine, otherwise you're going to die. Well, I didn't get the vaccine, I didn't die. So you're wrong. you know, um, there's some basic stuff that we have to do, I think. Yeah, I'm very, very pessimistic if you're ever going to get there. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we were there. I think we were in great shape, you know, 20 years ago. Um, I mean, I think 2000 was the golden age. Um, I really do. Um, and it's been
till
downhill
the
from there.
finance till the finance guys got involved.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly, they're finance
Yeah.
guys, but there you go.
Yes.
Anyway, but scientifically, I think there was good funding and yada yada yada. So my answer to you, I don't know. Clearly I am like I am terribly saddened by what's happening. Am I pessimistic in this? Yes, and I'm pessimistic that there are going to be very unfortunate consequences for human health and well-being. But I don't think those will be irreversible. And I think that they will change. And unfortunately, that change will be mitigated by um, some um, pretty severe deaths and
Hmm.
morbidity. So just for imagine that there's a new HIV that is spread through aerosol. Okay, like the
Hmm.
common cold. Oh, well, we don't need to fund scientists. We'll wear masks. I don't think people are going to be saying that. They're going to be saying, okay, where's that? Solve this. Oh, well, the NIH no longer exists because we cut the funding for it. Yeah, we have no idea. So I think there will be a bit of a backlash. And let me ask you this question.
Yeah.
So when I look at India and to a
Hmm.
certain extent China, but India and
Hmm.
China, two powerhouses of intellect and research and what have you, I don't know that the same thing exists there. Let's take India first as a sort
Hmm.
of pseudo democracy. Um, well,
What?
uh, all right, not a democracy. It's an autocracy, Mr. Modi. But let's say that
Yeah.
uh, is the disdain for science and experts the same in India? Do you think that it is here?
No, I don't think so. I think
No,
in
I didn't
India,
think so. No. Yeah.
yeah, I think I think in India they respect science. I mean, the problem with India is that it's a very poor country, as you know, and per capita GDP, I don't know, $120 or 300,
Yeah.
120 $300. I don't know exact numbers right now. So the primary goal of an individual in India is to survive and to have enough food to eat.
Yeah.
Um, and they don't have time for philosophical, questions, right? So I think, yeah, so China is in sort of similar way, but it's about 15 times better GDP than India.
Mhm.
And so things are a little different there. I don't know much about China, but at least from a numbers perspective, it looks a lot better. Um, and so I think, yeah. So sort of look at Scandinavia as sort of a contrast. So look at Sweden. Yeah,
Before we go
yeah,
there, Gil, I don't mean to
yeah,
cut you off, but I want to come back to India for a moment. So
yeah,
I heard you say that there wasn't such disdain for the so-called elites
yeah,
or the cognoscenti, the people who are trained rigorously in various sciences and
right.
other disciplines. Um, well, that to me bodes well. Yes, I'm not sure that
Mm,
GDP is the only I mean, America has a huge GDP, but it's whacking scientists left, right, and center, right?
mm,
So I don't think that GDP is the correlate, but rather is is could they then, they being India, be our
mm,
savior? So much as America or the Western science saves the world with all vaccines and antibiotics and drugs and what have you in one sense,
mm.
and technologically, maybe
Yeah.
India will fulfill that role. To get to your issue about pessimism,
Yeah.
and maybe China to some extent as well. I don't know.
So I have to say I don't know India very well. So I grew up in the southern state,
Yeah,
and I went to school in also in the southern, the other side of the country. And um, India is, as you know, is not a country unified. It's 26 different states, 20
yeah.
30 different languages, and all sorts of cultural differences. So my perspective is very different from any other Indian, I would think. And so, if you're asking sort of a larger societal question about India, I have to look at that as sort of a country with without a lot of education. I mean, it's a very large country, 1.4 billion people, um, and I can't even begin to think how we would manage a 1.4 billion system in a democratic context. Um, and so, yeah, so I don't know. I mean, India
Well,
is yeah, yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
part of
Go
that
ahead.
may explain something because
Yeah.
in England, when I grew up, only I think I think I'm right in saying 18% of high school graduates went on to university,
Mm.
right? And now it's more like America. I mean, it's like 80% or more. I
Oh,
mean,
wow. Okay.
everyone goes to university, and the
Yeah.
and every college now becomes a university, et cetera, and
Mm.
and so you wonder. So that's clearly not the case in India, as you say, because poverty is
Mm.
rife. But at the same time, maybe that's what needs to be done. So this sounds rather
Mm.
like a more Republican view of things, is to say there's so much crap going on. Let's just get rid of
Yeah.
all that and let's keep the stuff that's really good. Well, unfortunately, as we said, baby and bathwater, very difficult to do. But perhaps India
Mm.
is doing that economically by necessity. And so by having, I mean, there are some excellent, as you well know, you attended them, excellent
Mm.
universities in India producing high quality graduates, a
Mm.
lot of which were coming here, but now a lot of which are staying there.
Not
Um,
anymore. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Um, well,
So
both because they're
it's
not. Yeah. So
yeah.
just to finish that thought, maybe
Yeah.
I'm looking. You know, the America is over, and
Mm.
maybe it's India,
No.
India and or China. When I say over, I mean in terms of leadership in Nobel prizes and things like that.
No,
Yeah, I think
I
so.
don't see that. Yeah,
Mm,
I don't see
okay.
that at all. I think um, so. There are multiple issues here. One is related to scale. Um, Not many countries of the 200 countries that we have managed a 1.4 billion system. The 1.4 billion system come with only two countries have attempted it, um, with a bunch of problems.
Yeah.
It is less severe in China because it's actually more uniform. It's significantly more difficult
Yes.
in a place like India. So this is an experiment in in psychology, in humanity, can you really put together a country with 1.4 billion people? Um, I'm less convinced of that, actually.
Mm.
I've been, maybe I shouldn't say this. So yeah, so I grew up, as I said, in Kerala. Kerala is very different, as you know, from rest of India. They contained COVID very nicely. I was talking to somebody else from Northwestern yesterday that it's unclear to me that containing COVID early on has enough, sort of economic benefit for society because if it's going to come back later, yeah, I mean, if you have a hospital constraint, it's a good thing. But then other than that, it doesn't really help. So you go into this policy questions, which is you say, well, I'm going to go in and severely constrain populations to take care of the disease. But in exposed, oftentimes we find that that may not have been a good strategy. I'm going on a tangent here. Yeah.
Yes.
So yeah.
Well, maybe we should come back in a future discussion because I find
Yes.
this particularly interesting. I'd like to
Yeah.
talk about India and China because I see that as the future. And by that, I mean
Mm.
economically, scientifically and culturally in many ways. And you ask a good question whether India is manageable. Um, anyway, so I think that would be something interesting to come back. But perhaps we should leave it there because we've strayed from consciousness now. So if we have any listeners left.
It's admirable. Again, as an Englishman, you would support India because they are so good in cricket.
That's just a lucky
Yeah.
break. England will come back. We're letting you feel your oats for a while, but we're going, we'll rise again.
Yes.
It's in the genes.
Excellent. Yeah.
Okay,
Thanks so much
that's
for
fun,
spending
Gil.
time with me.
Yeah,
Thank
you
you.
too. Thanks a lot. Bye bye.
Bye.